Thank you for being here. This session will deal with the issue of what is the place or the value of diversity in civic republicanism and in the republic, more in general terms. So some of the proposed questions for the speakers to elaborate on, if they wish, concern how republicanism relates to populisms, to liberal forms of multiculturalism, or to democratic pluralism. Now that modern societies are more and more made up of people from very diverse territories with different social, political, cultural, and religious backgrounds, just to put some examples. So let me present the last three speakers. Please don't hesitate to correct me if I'm wrong with something. They are Peter Kraus. He's full professor of political science, director of the Institute for Canadian Studies, and co-director of the Center for Advanced Transnational Studies. These three positions at the University of Augsburg in Germany. Augsburg, yeah, I have said that. Augsburg, not Oxford. Yeah, Oxford, it's not in Germany. Moreover, he's a regular visiting professor here at UPF. And if I'm not wrong, during this academic course, he has been Joan Coromina's visiting professor in Catalan Studies at the University of Chicago. And his work deals primarily with language policy, cultural pluralism, nationalism, minority politics, and the problems of European integration and European identity. And just to highlight one of his titles, in 2018, he co-edited the book Multilingualism, Europeanization, Globalization, and Linguistic Governance. Then we have Victoria Costa. She's associate professor at the Department of Philosophy of the College of William and Mary in Virginia in the USA. She works on contemporary social and political philosophy and in applied ethics, and in particular on John Rawls' theory of justice, on neo-republicanism, and on civic education and immigration. And apart from her book, Rawls' Citizenship and Education, her latest publications include the articles Neo-Republicanism and the Domination of Immigrants in Res Publica, or Neo-Republicanism's Methodological Commitments and Individual Rights in Theory. And Cenzig Gunes is associate lecturer in politics and international relations at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Open University in the UK. And his research interests include, but are not restricted to, let's say, Turkish foreign and security policy, Kurdish nationalism and conflicts in the Middle East, or the accommodation of national minorities in Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. And in 2021, he published the book, The Political Representation of Kurds in Turkey, New Actors and Modes of Participation in a Changing Society. So we will start with Victoria, then Peter, and then Cenzig.
I was also thinking about the diversity in gender, sexual orientation, different kinds of social diversity, and a little bit about immigration, but it's not the only focus. So I would like to talk about the relationship between civic virtue, the law, and social norms in contemporary democratic societies that are pluralistic and diverse. So the civic virtues are often cited as tools of the Republican political project, but typically they were understood in a very narrow sense. In particular, civic virtues were associated with political activity within formal political institutions, and also with a willingness to defend Republican institutions against foreign threats and domestic threats. But I will argue that we should think of civic virtues in a wider sense that is associated with contestatory behavior aimed at expanding the enjoyment of rights in many areas of social life. So this reading is in line with a more radical interpretation of the Republican project. So as a starting point, I take it as granted Philip Petit's and Quentin Skinner's arguments that a central theme in the Republican tradition is the importance of freedom understood as non-domination. So that's my starting point. I'm thinking about Republicanism in connection with the ideal of non-domination. And on this understanding, people enjoy freedom when they are not enslaved or they are not subject to the arbitrary will of others. Of course, this is just an intuitive idea and it needs to be made more precise, but ideally a theory of freedom as non-domination should be developed so that it helps us to understand the ways in which individuals can be dominated in their interpersonal relationships, as well as when they are dominated as members of disadvantaged groups or as members of a political community living under a system of law. And I think that here it should apply also to include refugees and undocumented migrants who are not formally recognized as members of the political community in whose territory they reside. So a theory of domination should help us think about these groups. And if it doesn't include them as domination, I think it's a problem for the theory. And so according to Petit, a relationship of domination exists when an agent has the capacity to interfere arbitrarily with the actions and choices of another agent. And what this means is that the dominating agent can do things like physically coerce, threaten, manipulate, impose penalties, or withhold expected benefits from the dominated agent. And in this way, the dominating agent can control the other agent's behavior. Moreover, the dominating agent can do these things at will and with impunity because there's no appropriate checks that would protect the interests of the dominated party. And then, of course, some forms of domination are going to be more significant than others, but to count as a free person, one must not be subject to domination in important areas of their life. So even though in contemporary democratic societies, there are ideas of freedom and equality under the law that the system at least formally acknowledges, there are significant forms of domination that persist in their midst. And many times, Republicans use historical examples of extreme relationships of domination, such as slavery. Everybody talks about slavery, but then the theory should address the forms of domination that exist in our midst. And so one of the points I want to stress in the paper is that contestatory civic virtues are necessary in this project. It is these sort of virtues that allow us to reliably identify vulnerabilities to arbitrary interference of particular groups, make those vulnerabilities visible by means of political activity, and then propose strategies to keep them in check. So Petit has persuasively argued that Republican laws and policies constitute the freedom as non-domination of individuals, at least insofar as they robustly protect a set of basic liberties associated with the idea of a free citizen. Petit himself admits that there are limits to the appeal of this traditional image because it assumed that only propertied males were the ones that could enjoy the rights of citizenship. But there are also significant limits to the traditional understanding of basic rights and liberties that are the guarantees of non-domination. So for example, the historical understanding does not explicitly include the protection of sexual and reproductive rights, nor does it include rights such as paid pregnancy leave or paid parental leave in societies that have adequate resources to fund them. But in my view, these rights are crucial for the pursuit of individuals' plans of life and for supporting their political status as equal members of society. So it's not just the traditional idea of the free citizen and the rights of free citizen. We should think about what are the rights that should be granted to actually allow people to enjoy this status. So Petit, even if he's right that the law is a key constitutive element of freedom as non-domination, it's important to stress that the laws do not always combat domination. Some laws leave substantive powers of the state unchecked, allowing the state to interfere in objectionable ways in the lives of the general population or in the lives of particular groups. So recent examples from the United States include state laws that make it more difficult to exercise the right to vote that have been passed very recently, and state laws that prohibit or severely restrict access to abortion. So there are laws that are the source of domination. Moreover, the law often fails to adequately protect members of particular groups from the arbitrary exercise of power by private parties. And then here, Elizabeth Anderson has written on the domination of workers and how corporations in the United States have and use legally arbitrary power to control the behavior of workers. Now, for analytical purposes, it's useful to distinguish between domination by private parties and domination by the state, and Petit calls this dominion and imperium. And the agents that are involved in domination in these two cases are very different, and also are very different the powers at stake and the feasible mechanisms that we can use to control them. But all forms of private domination are made possible by powers explicitly granted by the law or by the failure of the state to regulate certain areas or activities. So this means that the state as a collective agent plays a role in sustaining even private domination. And one example clear is the domination of immigrant groups. If you think about temporary workers, they are dominated by employers when their visas depend on maintaining employment. Many of those workers are underpaid, receive less extensive benefits than native workers who do similar kinds of work, and they are vulnerable to harassment and other abuses. And they are also reluctant to make complaints when their rights are not respected because of lack of awareness of legal protections available and a fear of being deported. So despite the points I've been stressing, even a set of good laws will not be sufficient to guarantee the enjoyment of non-domination. The laws need to be backed by a network of social norms that help secure the robust protection of rights. Social norms are informal rules that specify what counts as acceptable behavior in a society or within a smaller groups. These norms create shared expectations of behavior and trigger different kinds of sanctions when people fail to comply. Sanctions may range from mild forms of public criticism, loss of important benefits, ostracism, or even violence. But sanctions do not need to go as far as physical violence to have significant effects on behavior. Jeffrey Brennan and Philip Pettit argue that the mere desire for approval is a significant source of motivation for many people, giving rise to what they call the economy of esteem. And so the belief that their behavior is required by norms shared by a group induces compliance with these norms, even in the absence of severe sanctions for non-compliance. Now, but as in the case with laws, social norms are not by their very nature opposed to domination. That is, they can help reduce domination when they operate, but they also can operate in ways that support it. They support domination when they hold different groups to different standards of behavior, creating systematic advantages for some and systematic disadvantages for others. For example, even after passing laws that prohibit discrimination against women, social expectations that women will do most of the unpaid work of caring for children and family members continue to create barriers to women's access to well-paid and desirable jobs and other social benefits. There are also norms that encourage racism, xenophobia, bigotry, hostility towards outsiders, even as they support respect, cooperation, and sense of belonging among members of in-groups. And so, for example, poor immigrants are often targeted in this way in many societies. And so it may be more difficult for them to find employment and housing, to participate in a variety of social activities, and to feel integrated in their new society. And when social norms that are hostile to immigrants are widespread, politicians often try to gain political support by proposing restricted immigration laws, limiting the public benefits available to immigrants, and even persecuting and criminalizing undocumented immigrants who have not committed any serious crimes. So both desirable and undesirable social norms can emerge, spread, change, and die out as a result of very complex factors that are difficult to fully comprehend, let alone control. So in earlier work, I've argued in favor of distinguishing between a wide network of desirable social norms that Pettit calls widespread civility on the one hand, and what I call widespread civic virtue. I take the general notion of civic virtue to consist of a set of stable traits of character that exhibit a number of excellencies associated with membership in a political community. But to provide a Republican account of civic virtues, this general notion needs to be narrowed down by considering which traits tend to promote freedom as non-domination. And so this understanding of Republican civic virtue assumes a background of minimally favorable conditions and a long-term view, because in context of widespread corruption, a minority's virtuous behavior could easily fail to have any impact on freedom as non-domination, so that we will produce it under some favorable conditions. Now, civic virtue is different from petty civility, which is a mere disposition to act according to desirable social norms. And this is true even if the behavior that each elicits is indistinguishable. The existence of desirable social norms sets beneficial standards of behavior and supports a variety of cooperative activities. It makes it easy for people to know what is expected of them without the need to spend time and effort to figure this out. In contrast, acting virtuously sometimes requires careful deliberation and judgment in response to particular circumstances in which agents find themselves in. Following norms is easier and more mechanical than being virtuous, and the desire for peer approval may provide sufficient motivation to do so. Compliance with good norms is desirable, but importantly, so is the ability to note when norms are bad, to resist them, and to challenge them. This is why political activity in support of good causes requires capacities for moral and political judgment that are characteristic of good citizens or virtuous citizens. So civic virtues are most needed in complex, challenging circumstances in which good behavior requires unusual types of excellence in thinking, feeling, and acting. These are the circumstances in which merely following prevailing norms might lead or sustain very bad outcomes. So Frank Lovett has reconstructed the views of civic virtue endorsed by different historical Republicans in connection with their concern with the problem of political stability. This is the problem of whether a political outlook can be freely endorsed by current and new members of a polity, shaping their political behavior and helping sustain distinctive institutions and practices over time. Lovett argues that Republicans' claims about the importance of civic virtues were responses to a number of perceived dangers facing historical republics. In particular, discussions of patriotism and courage were motivated by the constant threat of conquest and subjugation by foreign powers. Other traits, like the disposition to be politically informed and engaged, to obey the law, to moderate one's political demands, were meant to help defend Republican institutions and laws against the potential corruption of leaders or undue factionalism. So in brief, civic virtues were expected to help sustain the institutions and practices of a well-functioning republic. But it's worth noting that this understanding of the civic virtues was associated with a very limited view of who could qualify as a virtuous citizen. Some historical Republicans defended an aristocratic political regime, while others have a more democratic model that made room for some power sharing among social classes. But even the most democratic models took for granted that the majority of the adult population could be permissibly excluded from the rights and liberties of citizenship: slaves, foreigners, workers without property, women. So such exclusions did not prevent popular revolts and demands for civil and political rights, which serve the cause of expanding Republican freedom in the long run. But the fact is, this type of political contestation was often not interpreted as displaying any kind of civic virtue. But in fact is, major steps in the expansion of civil and political rights were gained by means of persistent political contestation and civil disobedience by people situated outside formal political channels. And so the right thing to say is that many participants in these activities exhibited genuine civic virtues. There are a few neo-Republican theories who have examined the civic activity of people who are not recognized as full citizens, but who nevertheless challenge the dominating legal and political order to gain access to some rights, liberties, or social benefits enjoyed by more privileged groups. So we can call this activity formal institutional contestation. The suffragists, the American Civil Rights Movement, the workers' movements are often cited as examples of political activity directed at expanding the enjoyment of rights so as to include subordinated groups. More recent examples include women's movements to legalize abortion in Argentina and other Latin American countries, and LGBTQ plus movement for the expansion of civil rights. These seem to me clear examples of political activity displaying civic virtues. These groups were engaged in political reflection and organizing, in the education of members, and in a variety of methods of contestation in complex circumstances that involve significant forms of domination. Contestatory activity by members of vulnerable groups is essential to overcome persistent forms of domination that primarily affects those groups, since other people often lack capacities to perceive it or motivation to combat it. Now, beyond formal institutional contestation, there is another means for promoting freedom as non-domination, one that has hardly received any attention in the neo-Republican literature. And this involves informal political activity aimed at changing the social norms that help sustain domination. So instead of focusing on the law and institutions, focusing on informal social norms. Abolishing openly discriminatory laws is of course important, but changing social norms is also a necessary component of the Republican project. Changes in the law that are not accompanied by relevant changes in social norms sometimes result in very limited progress in reducing arbitrary interference in the lives of subordinated groups. In fact, such legal changes may generate backlash that actually undermines the protections of the law. This can happen when social norms and prejudice continue to sustain attitudes and practices that pose significant threats of harm to members of these groups or reduce the options available to them. So some of the political activities of feminist and LGBTQ+ groups are therefore sensibly directed at changing rigid norms concerning gender roles and family responsibilities. When these norms are widespread, they create significant obstacles to the life projects of those who do not comply with them, even without open legal discrimination by the state. And so, for example, prejudiced individuals can be members of hiring committees for desirable jobs. They could be juries in criminal trials. They could be social workers with influence in custody cases, or they could be bank employees deciding who qualifies for a loan. So many activities require that other people take our claims seriously, place their trust on us, and demonstrate a willingness to cooperate with us on fair terms. And so to rid of society of the obstacles created by prejudice, we therefore need to be significant changes in the social ethos, creating new norms to regulate social interactions. So in fact, social norms supported by civic virtues often provide important checks against interference when the laws of the state themselves dominate groups, as it is clearly the case with refugees and undocumented immigrants. In this respect, it seems to me that the civic virtues, in this widely understood sense, are a key part of the unfinished project of creating an inclusive democratic republic. Okay.
Thanks for a great workshop. I already said this morning. I learned a lot, and I think that what Cengiz, I guess so, and I are going to do will link nicely to what others have been doing. Also, in my case, at least, I have to say that I am not a political theorist, right? So we have had basically political theory people here and historians, if we include Manslatura in the historians section. And I'm rather a political sociologist with a strong theoretical interest, but I'm not that much interested in the world how it should be. These I leave to you guys. I'm more interested in the world how it is, right? And that's what I'm going to talk about. So I will do basically two things. I think I will not have much more time. I will briefly talk about the tension that has been historically built in the relationship between peoplehood and diversity. I think that's one very short thing to do. And then I will introduce a new category, according to my knowledge at least, which I call popular republicanism, which again, in my understanding, represents a new approach to dealing with this tension or even contradiction. And you will tell me then, I use two cases to substantiate this empirical claim, namely the Catalan sovereignist movement, let's say in the period between 2010 and 2018. Now it's over. I think we have to admit this. It's not there anymore. And then the case of the Turkish Kurdish party HDP, right, on which Cengiz knows way more than I do, so it's good. I will be brief on both. I think it's more important that I focus on the theoretical side. So, and here I think it's nothing which comes surprisingly, and we've heard a lot about this. Historically speaking, the relationship between the concept of the people, and this concept can also be also known as the nation or the demos. So I'm talking about democratic peoples, by the way. It's not an ethnic category. I'm talking about democratic peoples. Has been very much built on basically suppressing diversity. In many concrete historical cases. That's not nothing I'm inventing. This is just historical evidence, but I will not explain much on this. I think we all know this. And of course, for good reasons, good in empirical terms, not normatively, unity has, the unity of the people has often been simply a reflection of hegemonic relations of groups. So based on hegemonic relations, in terms of social, cultural, and political power, right? I think this has to be thought together. And what happens then, to cut a very complex story very short and to be a bit superficial, but I think it's in a nutshell, it's true that after 1968, which represents a major paradigmatic break with this view of democracy, there has been a wave of more open and inclusive approaches to defining peoplehood, including more and more people into the demos. Think of the case of Switzerland, where in 1970, right, 1970, in some cantons, the women were given the right to vote. So Switzerland has been a democratic republic for centuries, allegedly, but it took a long time before women were included. Think of the US and the Afro-Americans and so on, where effectively the US were not a full democracy before 1970, you could say, if you look at the right to vote for Afro-Americans. So we have different attempts to opening up democracy, and you could call this whole exercise democratizing democracy, right? To make democracy itself susceptible of democratic change, and especially the demos. And again, to cut things very short, I would say that in many respects, the upsurge of right-wing populism in the last 2 to 3 decades has been somehow a cultural response of old hegemonic majorities, or of people who think of themselves as being these majorities, to these approaches. And I can show you just 2 slides to make the point. This is, I just use my everyday evidence for everything, basically. That's a non-theoretical, a very inductive way. So this is a neighborhood in Chicago called Pilsen. So historically a Czech neighborhood a couple of weeks ago. And you see here that we the people from the US Constitution is interpreted in terms of including new groups into these people, right? In the terms of collective emancipation. Somos un pueblo, so now Pilsen is a Mexican neighborhood. So the opening up of the concept of the people to new groups, and I could talk about plenty of these groups. So the whole emergence of identity politics to some extent in the last decades has been based on this objective. But there is of course also the more ugly side of this, and this is the we the people which won the elections in the US 6 years ago, and still claims that they also won the elections 2 years ago, and they can be seen as let's say a attempt at reinstalling this old hegemonic relationship between the old WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority, and other groups. And they argue that this has been, they have been the great exchange thing, right? They are being replaced by immigrants, or they're being threatened by the establishment. Their sovereignty has been kidnapped. That's populism. So the use of the concept of the people in a way too, right? So we have both sides. The previous side is the more the 1968 legacy, the opening up, the processual, I think you would say the processual view of constructing the people as a process. And this is more the essentialist monist view that has been historically dominant. Good. Now what happens in this context, I think, and now I move from the concept of the people to populism and diversity. Of course, the populist element in very superficial terms is built into both pictures I just showed you, in the Somos un Pueblo and the Trumpist one. And in this respect, both types of approach have been labeled in different ways as prone to populism, and I think this is wrong. And I think this is wrong because what we need to do when we want to assess and classify political movements, projects that use the rhetoric of the popular, to paraphrase Laclau, is not that these projects invoke the people. So I think all democratic projects have to invoke the people. I buy Laclau's point basically that there is no democracy without populism in some way, right? You need to construct the people to have democratic politics. But I would depart from his approach to some extent, but it's important also to see how they invoke the people, what's the way they use for doing this. And basically here, the litmus test would be to check to what extent the project involved embraces an open and pluralist attitude towards diversity. I think that's the key point. Now, as I just told, in the realm of real politics, so even the processual approaches, the one Somos un Pueblo refers still to we the people, so they keep basically sticking to what I call a monist bias of peoplehood and sovereignty. Monist meaning that they take what Andreas has been labeling, that was very helpful for me, constituted sovereignty for granted. So they assume that there is a people, the US people, and that's the people that has been there forever, and it has to be opened up to new elements of society. And in this respect, they still keep to this monist, they keep committed to this monist legacy that understands the people on the basis of unity that is basically based on one exclusive source of sovereignty. That's a very simplistic reading of it, but it's still, it's an opening up, it's democratizing democracy on a monist basis. I think that's the key point. And now what I'm really curious about, and I think that's something that has been totally underestimated in many cases of political practices of the last decades, we have seen the birth of a third type of approach that on the one hand does accept the dynamic and processual view of peoplehood, but also understands that there have been historically and still at present many different, even contradictory trajectories and conflicting historical narratives when it comes to constituting the people, right? So they do not take this monist source of sovereignty, of the sovereign people, for granted. They rather challenge it. But then, of course, they have to work in concrete political spaces. And this may then require articulating a collective political subject. They still have to construct people, but on the basis of different historicities and geographies of people making. That's the key point of what I'm presenting. So if you want to go home now, you just have to see the key point of what I'm trying to tell you. And I think that's the new thing I'm trying to convey with this concept, which I call popular republicanism, not to have to call it populist, because I think populist is an over-inflated concept. I think there are three elementary forms of conceiving of the people in relation with diversity. One is what can be labeled monist essentialism, right? That's the standard. In fact, I think still today, Modi in India, the PP and Vox in Spain, to some extent, even the socialists, France, anyway, they are based on this kind of monist essentialism. Then you have the Habermas guys, we have people like Andreas and so on, I guess, and many others who would accept that there is pluralism, but maybe you're not on that ticket anymore. I think I was unfair. I apologize in public. So please erase this from the tape, what I just said. I don't want to be sued by a German colleague. No, so there is monist pluralism, right? So I think Habermas does fit here. I think he thinks that there must be one sovereign notion of unitary peoplehood, but he would accept that this has to be made a flexible and open one. And then there is the third category, there is collective pluralism, right? So they would accept, these people would accept that there is no unitary basis of peoplehood either, that it's a precarious thing. So it comes close to some extent to what Andreas was pointing out in his last slide. So this kind of peoplehood as a subject of permanent democratic political contestation, which can be, of course, tiring. I think many people here are victims of this, right? Over the last 10 years. So I wonder if this is the best way of dealing with the challenge, but I think it may be necessary, at least in a transitory period. So let me now move to the second part. These collective pluralist forces I call popular republican. So that's my way of defining popular republicanism. And I think this has basically two reasons I don't like people like myself, right? I don't like people who come up with new categories all the time. And I think I've not based my career on doing that, but I was simply tired of the overinflation of populism. Populism was basically everywhere. You went to the toilet, take a leak, you were in the restaurant, everything was populist, right? So all kinds of questioning the establishment are populist. And then in a way, I got tired of this when I saw that in the, not only in the newspapers, but in the literature, there are about 50 I counted articles, academic articles, right? In peer-reviewed journals, putting that Catalonia in the last 10 years has been a typical case of the explosion of populism in Western Europe. I think that's nonsense. Really. I think that's there. Of course, there are populist elements in Catalan independentism, but it does not. It's not the brand of the movement, populism. And a similar case can be made in the case of Turkey and the HDP. Right, Turkey is a populist polity anyway, so Turkey is a populist country in some extent, but if somebody is not really exposed to this kind of pressure, it's rather the HDP than anybody else in that country. So I was, and again, in the HDP, you find many people who would just say, this is the classical case of left populism. Also, left populism is kind of a contradiction in terms, I would say, from my approach, but I'm not going to enter this debate. So the category popular republicanism I use as an alternative concept for movements that on the one hand do challenge the political establishment, invoking the sovereign people, right? But on the other hand, and of course this is a Weberian ideal type. I'm not telling that Catalans and Kurds are exactly fitting this ideal type, but they do operate with an open, dynamic, and multi-dimensional nation of peoplehood, which is not monist anymore. At least that's my hypothesis. That's my bet. And this then links two types of demand, which are typically Republican. On the one hand, the empowerment of citizens as the people vis-a-vis oligarchic tendencies of contemporary democracies and societies, right? This is about social inequality, about capitalism. This I call then civic sovereignty. Popular Republicans want to be civic sovereigns. And in some cases, when we had the tough luck of living in a state like Spain or Turkey as minorities, then you may also want to add the constituent sovereignty in the very sense Andreas has been using the term, so I don't have to explain this. So this is the right to transform the foundations of a state whose origin is anyway, in all cases, pre-democratic. There is no state that has been founded as a democratic project. All states are have an authoritarian legacy, but they can be changed through democratic means. And then we have to see how do these changes work? How are they, can they be operated? To what extent is the state responsive to this kind of demand? So we have the following dimensions of popular republicanism. And again, I'm really surprised to what extent the debate so far has been reflecting this, because I have not, I think basically people have been invited by Luis and not by me, although we were talking about this all the time. So we have civic sovereignism and constituent sovereignism, which I already explained. And then we have three more elements, which I think are important to classify movements as more or less popular Republican and not populist, right? So we have the adoption of key elements of Republican political discourse, but this adoption is implicit. It's not that people have been spending days like this the last 5 years reading Pettit and Skinner and whoever else, but the whole discourse they use to substantiate their claims is that they do not want to be dominated. They want to be free. That's one important aspect. And the second, which in a way links to the previous one, is that they follow a bottom-up dynamic. There is no elaborate theory, and there are very strong references to the local context and to the local history, which Javier Domènech, I was almost saying Tony Domènech, Javier Domènech and Montserrat Tura were exposing nicely this morning. So I think that to link the two concepts, the notion of self-determination is quite helpful, because self-determination does not only affect, of course, the cultural dimensions, but also the social dimensions. I have, how many time have I left? How much time? So you have, 2.5 minutes. So I will be now, 5. I can be quick. What I do now in the remaining part of the paper, but I can summarize this, is I use three elements to compare two cases and to see to what extent they empirically match my ideal type of being popular Republican. The one case is Catalan sovereignism, and I don't have to explain what this means, I think, to people here that would be carrying oaths to Athens, so to speak. But the key point here, this is the 9/11 demonstration in 2014, the V thing, right? But what I do then is to see how these movements, so let me begin with the Catalans, deal with homogeneity, diversity, and sovereignty. And just to tackle the second aspect, diversity, in the Catalan case, I will be a bit more detailed on the HDP, because then Cengiz can correct me immediately. I think there's an entry. I don't know if you can you read this? Yes. So this is some simple slide from 2018-19, where the electorate of different parties is classified according to the extent they agree with the statement "amb tanta immigració, un ja no se sent com a casa." With that much immigration, one does not feel at home anymore. And you see exactly that the more independentist, the more sovereignist, the more radical, if you want, the groups are on the independent side. So that leads basically to the CUP and to Esquerra Republicana. The more open they are to immigration, right? So that's not the we the people imagery the Trumpist electorate is conveying. It's the very opposite of it, and this can also be seen, right? This is two independentists, two new Catalans supporting independence on that demonstration in 2014. They are not exactly the typical Catalan people doing pilgrimages to Montserrat, embracing the Moreneta, and so I think that's something else, right? So it's not about becoming homogeneous according to some majority standards. And finally, also sovereignty. I think that's important. The Catalans and also the Kurds have a very soft understanding of sovereignty. So the movement I'm talking about, it was not about creating kind of a North Korean sovereign state isolated from the rest of the world here in the northwest of Spain. It's a more open line, which rather blurs even the differences between what is called technically an internal and an external secession, right? And of course, in this respect, the European Union is very important. Let me now move to Turkey very briefly. That's the link between the two cases, so the Catalan flag and the Kurdish flag. And here you see the logo of the, can you pronounce this for me?
It's Halkların Demokratik Partisi.
Halkların. Right? So, and what's very important here, just to make the point already now, is that Halkların means of the people. So it's the Democratic Party of the peoples in plural, right? That's also the peoples are not specified. And this party represents the Kurds, basically, in Turkey today, and also sectors, small sectors, one has to say, of the Turkish left. It was founded 10 years ago and has suffered since then an increasing repression by the Erdogan regime. The co-leader of the party, Selahattin Demirtas, is in jail since 2016, has not had what you would call in English due process, right? He's a victim of arbitrariness and injustice. And just to do the same thing which I did with the Catalans in the Kurdish case, which is totally ignored, well, not totally, but ignored by many. I think Catalans should be even more popular Republican in the sense of being more internationalist. There are many cases which would be would be interesting for being looked into. Also, some indigenous movements in Latin America, by the way, they come close to this as well. So what the HDP does is, in my reading, again, idealizing a bit. It's an ideal type. I'm trying to balance here against reality. What they do is to respond to the dominating ethnic Turkish chauvinism, which is a great Turkish chauvinism, by conceiving of collective identity in a way that emphasizes the will to overcome homogeneity and to frame it in a non-monist way. Diversity, again, is represented, if you look at demonstrations by the party, it has a highly diverse body of supporters, not only Kurds, also Turkish students, intellectuals, Alevis, feminists, LGBT activists, and grassroots associations. And the republicanism of the party, I don't know if it's declaredly Republican at all, maybe not, I guess rather not, because republicanism in Turkey is a bad thing for many minorities, for basically all of them. They focus on equal citizenship and still reject the goal of creating a uniform body politic. So you can see this is a nice combination of the tradition and modernity in this respect. So the different types of celebrating feminism, if you want, in different ways, with and without the headscarf. And finally, again, sovereignty is conceived of in a non-statist way, and also in a very porous and open way. So what the party is talking about is basically what they call a Turkish-Kurdish confederalism with a strong municipalist bias, right? So bottom-up thing that would be the approach to be adopted according to them, but I think it doesn't look very good for them in the present context. So again, what my interest was rather empirical than normative, and I think there are interesting things going on which deserve further study not as a substitute for the normative and theoretical debates, which we need as well, right? But I think it's good to contrast what you do in your head's laboratory with real life experiences. I think there's much to be learned from what is happening in reality in many places, and I leave it here. I think that Cengiz will link to what I just said immediately. Thank you.
Yeah, I need that. Thank you. I'll wait for Guillaume to put up the presentation, but before that, I just want to begin by saying thank you to Luis and to other members of the Josep Irla Foundation for putting this very interesting workshop together, and for inviting me. And I also want to thank Peter for recommending me. I've learned a lot as well in this talk, in this workshop. So yeah, that's, sorry. Go back. Yeah. I didn't actually have a title. I just kind of was thinking about what would be the good title yesterday, and I thought Kurt's encounter with republicanism will work. As Peter mentioned, the word republicanism in Turkish political discourse is quite negative, has a lot of negative connotation, especially for minorities, and it does not at all feature in the Kurdish political discourse, even though, as Peter mentioned, there is a kind of there's a Republican element to the discourse. So yeah, let me begin by kind of elaborating a little bit on the Turkey's problem with pluralism. And Turkey has a very big problem with pluralism and the recognition of non-Turkish and non-Muslim national minorities or cultures. And initially, the Kurds were supposed to be one of the constituent elements of Turkey. And so there was the War of Liberation. The Kurds took part in that. Turkey was going to be a state for both Kurds and Turks. But what happened was that as soon as they won the war and as soon as they got the recognition, the Turkish nationalists, they kind of completely forgot about the promises that they were making to the Kurds. And they started to create a state, an institutional setup, which and a political culture which centers on Turkish identity. Turkish as an ethnic, but also a national identity. It says something like everybody who is tied to the state of Turkey with ties of citizenship is a Turk. But Turk is not like it does not refer to Turkey as a whole. It refers to an ethnic group within Turkey. And this creates a lot of, has created and still creates a lot of barriers for the recognition of Kurds as a distinct national group. So Turkey is a unitary and highly centralized republic, and Turkishness as a national and ethnic identity is placed at the center of citizenship. And this exclusivist way Turkish citizenship was defined had significant consequences for the Kurds, as the category of the universal national rights were assigned only to the Turkish nation, and the Kurds' subsequent articulation of their group-specific demands and rights was considered illegitimate. So Kurdish political discourse therefore engages with republicanism in a kind of a critical way. It's kind of a critique of Turkish republic. Whatever they wanted was kind of what was the opposite of what was in Turkey, in a way. And there have been, until now, two main Kurdish political struggles against Turkish domination. One of them was led by the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is an armed group, and it's an illegal group, and it was initially motivated by creating a Kurdish state in what the Kurds call Greater Kurdistan in Iraq, Iran, parts of Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. And it was a national liberation movement. So it was the new state was going to be a socialist republic. And so there is the kind of idea of a republic, but it does not engage with the Republican thinkers or ideas or concepts at all. And what happened was in 1990s, PKK has undergone a lot of ideological transformations. And in its current form, its objective is to transform. It no longer wants to create a Kurdish republic. It now wants to transform Turkey to a democratic republic. So we have this idea of a democratic republic, but again, not much elaboration of sort of ideas from the Republican tradition. And the second movement is a legally organized movement, and it's a political movement that broadly constructs its political demands around democracy and pluralism in Turkey. And their goal was and still is to transform Turkey into a democratic and plurinational republic. And I will elaborate on each project a little. But before I do, I just want to show you a map of Turkey and where the Kurds, so the dark area, the black area, is where the Kurds kind of constitute a majority. And the adjacent area is where Kurds constitute something between 30 to 40% of the population. And Kurds are at the moment like all over Turkey. So there are Kurdish communities everywhere in the west of Turkey, in big cities. So the reason I show you this is that when people talk about solving the Kurdish question in Turkey, they often mention the idea of territorial autonomy. But in this case, as it clearly shows, a territorial autonomy would not be resolving the question. So we need a new approach. And this was kind of one of the main limitations. This was the condition what required in a way to come up with a new proposal to solve the question. This will make more sense. So Peter mentioned HDP, the People's Democratic Party, but so the People's Democratic Party is the current kind of representative of what I call the pro-Kurdish democratic movement, which was established established as a party. It was established on 7th of June 1990. So since then, there have been pro-Kurdish parties in Turkey. And as Peter also mentioned, this is a movement which has experienced very intense repression throughout its existence. We have literally thousands of people detained, arrested, imprisoned, and some of them were killed. And as Peter mentioned, the co-leader of the HDP, Selahattin Demirtas, was arrested about nearly 5 years ago. And it actually has two leaders. One of them has to be a woman. So the other co-leader was also arrested. She's in prison as well at the moment. And many of the MPs were imprisoned as well. And the apostrophe is very important. I have actually once, I was refereeing for a journal, and one person has written the name of the HDP with the apostrophe before S, and I thought that's a good enough reason to reject the paper, because essentially it shows that they haven't understood what HDP is about. So, so yeah, and Peter has actually mentioned some of this. So basically, it's a party. It's, as I mentioned, it's a radical democratic party. In Turkey, what we have is various different groups which are being marginalized and repressed. But because each of them kind of focus on their own specific struggle, it's easy for the government or the state to kind of keep them marginalized. And the idea of bringing them together was kind of conceived around maybe 10, 15 years ago. And they kind of created organizations or platforms where they contested political elections together, and they kind of had demonstrations together, things like that, just kind of bringing people together. And that is kind of carried over into the HDP's program. It says we are a party of Turkey's working classes, laborers, peasants, tradespeople, pensioners, women, youth, intellectuals, artists, LGBT individuals, and disabled. The disabled, the oppressed, and the exploited of all nations. So it tries to represent everybody in Turkey. Languages, cultures, and faiths. So every ethnic group, every religious group, and the aim is to bring them together into creating a bigger political bloc. And it is also HDP is the parliamentary kind of representative of the People's Democratic Congress, and People's Democratic Congress is composed of maybe 15 or 20 different organizations, and some of them are quite large organizations. And so, and they don't just advocate a kind of a representative democracy. They perceive democracy within, they don't perceive democracy within the limits of representative democracy. It defends and struggles to realize the removal of barriers preventing citizens from debating, organizing, and directly participating in the decision-making mechanisms, to establish public scrutiny on all levels and public's right to express its will and make decisions. So it has a very strong grassroots organization, and it wants to create a structure whereby people are made stronger political actors. So people are participating in politics. So the reason I kind of I also see the connection with republicanism is that basically the notion of freedom as non-domination. They want to create structures which prevent the non-domination of people. And they want different groups within society to be the people who actually manage these structures. So that's the kind of the project. So it says, this is again from the party's program. Our party believes that a fundamental solution to all identity and cultural problems is possible with the adoption of new democratic and pluralistic constitution that promotes freedom and equality. Our party struggles for the realization of the constitutional assurance of equality of rights of different identities, languages, beliefs, and culture, and a definition of constitutional citizenship shaped on this understanding. Education in mother tongue and application of right of using mother tongue in every area of life, including the public sphere, and the democratic autonomy operating on the basis of local self-governance. So that's kind of the broad objective, and I will unpack some of them. So it wants to divide, I shouldn't say divide, because in Turkey, when Turks hear a Kurd use the word divide, they get really scared. That because the separatists, they want to get rid of Turkey, they want to create a new state, and so it's a loaded term. But what they want to do is basically create between 20 to 25 regional administrations. And this is according to territorial division. So it's a kind of a decentralized political structure in Turkey. And it wants these autonomous administrations to have a lot of power. Autonomy in all areas except foreign affairs, border controls, and national security. And it wants to create it wants to facilitate widespread democratization to enable collective decision-making and grassroots democracy. develop gender equality, and build environmentally sustainable communities. So it's kind of it's like a feminist party, it's like a socialist party, and also an environmentalist party all in one, in a way. And it has this something called co-leadership. So all the elected positions have to be shared by a man and a woman. And some of the other measures as well, like at least 40% of the MPs should be women and stuff like that. And it wants to create, it wants constitutional recognition of group rights and group identities. And at the moment, and for the past nearly 40 years, there has been a kind of an active military conflict between the PKK and Turkish security forces. And one of the HDP's key demands is to create, to solve this conflict through peaceful democratic solution. Okay. The other movement I mentioned is the PKK. And I also mentioned that it was a national liberation movement, which had the aim of creating a Kurdish state in Greater Kurdistan. And also in 1990s, it kind of underwent a significant ideological transformation. And now its aim is to create a democratic republic in Turkey. It is still a pan-Kurdish entity. It wants to create a Kurdish society, but not a state. It wants to create a Kurdish democracy, non-state democracy, and Kurds to have or obtain their rights within the existing states in the Middle East. And so, yeah, so basically it uses words like democratic transformation and democratic solution. And in the context of Turkey, it wants to transform Turkey to become a democratic republic. And it describes Turkey at the moment as an oligarchic republic. So from oligarchic republic to a democratic republic. This part, as I mentioned it, so PKK still has a pan-Kurdish sort of political project, and it wants to realize this within a democratic confederalist structure. But it's a structure, not a state. It's like it wants this non-state entity to coexist within the existing states in Turkey. So there will still be existing international borders in the Middle East, but it wants Kurdish entity to kind of coexist across these states. And it's basically it's based on the recognition, protection, and freedom of expression of all cultural beings. It takes its basic principle to be the democratic solution to the Kurdish question, the recognition of Kurdish identity at all levels, and the development of Kurdish language and culture. So this entity will promote that, basically. And it's a democracy. So democratic confederalism is based on grassroots participation. A decision-making process lies with the communities. Higher levels only serve the coordination and implementation of the will of the communities. I think I have another slide which elaborates on this more. So it says, our goal is not to establish a state, but democracy. This is the Abdullah Öcalan. He still is the leader of the PKK, but he has been in jail since 99. And so he's been the main theoretician, if you like, the main discourse producer, and he came up with these strategies that the PKK has adopted subsequently. So he says, I understand the right to self-determination of nations in the following way. It is the right to build its democracy and non-state self-government. It is the right of the non-state groups, communities to create their model, to discuss and solve their own problems at the level of villages, neighborhoods, and cities. Our goal is not to establish a state, but democracy, the right to create their own democracy, not on the basis of political boundaries and not making the existing political boundaries an issue. This kind of this description fits quite neatly with the Kurdish case. So he has the Kurds in his mind when he's writing that, but he kind of expresses it as in a more general way. And so, yeah, and there's another concept called democratic autonomy. So this one is supposed to coordinate Kurdish communities' relations within the state. So there will be democratic autonomy in Kurdish democratic autonomy in Turkey and in Syria and in Iran, if the PKK manages to achieve its objectives. And basically, autonomy is understood as different cultures and communities deciding for themselves on matters relating to their rights and being responsible for governing their affairs. It's a model of accommodating Kurdish rights in Turkey, and also it's a framework to arrange Kurds' relations with the state in Turkey. It's a kind of a case of sovereignty sharing, I think. It's basically, it wants to create Kurds as it wants to organize Kurds as a nation within Turkey, and Kurds will have all the national rights that other nations have, all the universal national rights, but not the separate state. And when I was doing my PhD in sort of 2008-9, when I was reading around these proposals, I came across the work by Karl Renner and Otto Bauer, and what they were talking about in national cultural autonomy is kind of similar to what Öcalan was talking about, democratic autonomy. But the idea has a diverse intellectual origin. So Öcalan draws from critical Foucauldians to Murray Bookchin, who was an anarchist, Judith Butler, quite a diverse thinkers. And it's so basically kind of he wants to create a direct democracy, organize a direct democracy. Now, when people were talking about, when the ideas were first being discussed in public and when the ideas were first introduced, everyone was thinking, this is, people who were saying this is a good idea and stuff like that, but this will never work in a place like Middle East, especially. Because what we have in Middle East is very authoritarian, exclusive, identities, Arab nationalists, Turkish nationalists, Persian nationalists, and there is no room for allowing diversity. And what happened was in Syria, after the conflict, after the civil war broke out, what happened was there are quite maybe 3 million Kurds in Syria. And what Assad did was he removed his soldiers from the Kurdish regions. And this gave the Kurds an opportunity to implement this model of democratic autonomy. And what they have created is, at the moment, the entity they have created is called the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria. And it's basically a multi-ethnic region, and it's about embodying democracy and pluralism, and it's about decentralized political power. And so the community, the whole community is organized around seven. There are 7 what they call cantons, and each of them have their own democratic autonomous administration. And internally, the cantons are subdivided into smaller administrative regions. And essentially, there's a commune. The lowest kind of level is the commune. And a commune is sort of at the level of the neighborhood in a city or a village in a rural area. And this commune is linked upward. And there were 3,700 communes in the autonomous administration of Northeast Syria at the time. And yeah, and it has a constitution, which it calls the social contract. And it says, so the democratic federalism of northern Syria is based on geographic concept and an administrative and political decentralization. It is part of the United Syrian Democratic Federalism. The consensual democratic federal system guarantees the participation of all individuals and groups on equal levels in the discussion, decision, and implementation of affairs. It takes the ethnic and religious differences into consideration according to the characteristics of each group based on the principle of mutual coexistence and people's fraternity. Again, peoples in the plural. So, so that's the kind of, it's been implemented, and so far it came into existence at a very difficult time. It had to deal with the Islamic State, which was, and so the administration was one of the key kind of targets of the Islamic State. So it, with the help of America and other coalition partners, it has defeated ISIS. And now what the region has is a problem with Erdogan, and you have the map. This might be a little bit old. So the yellow areas and the red areas used to be part of the administration, but have been taken over by Turkey through the invasion. And Erdogan wants to kind of create a buffer zone in the, you can see the red line. That's where basically almost all Kurds live. So he wants to take over this and create a regime that is more kind of closer to his ideology. So I don't know, I'm kind of concluding with this map. Basically, it's the first case where this idea was put in practice. Probably there are various difficulties. It has faced various difficulties, and it probably has weaknesses and things to work on. But remarkably, it has provided some sort of sense of security to the whole population. It created a structure where Arabs, Kurds, and other ethnic groups are coexisting. And so sometimes what is seen as possible needs to be sort of, or what people think is not possible can be challenged. And it shows that, especially in the Middle East, that if people are given a chance, they can create structures that represent everyone, that is inclusive, and that has ideals such as pluralism, feminism, equality as its core ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So now it's time for the last open debate, the last questions and answers time.
I have two questions for Victoria and Cengiz. Maybe first to Victoria. I am afraid that I got sometimes lost in your talk, but this was mainly because the day was so long. So let me just take the opportunity to ask a question that interests me on the subject that you talked about, and please excuse if you actually said this in your talk. So I really liked how you combined the idea of social virtues with social norms, or virtues in general with social norms. I think this is really an important extension of Pettit. Just the basic question, and because we really need those virtues in the more constituent forms of politics. Just a basic question, how can these virtues be strengthened? I think this is always the problem with all kinds of virtue theories. It would be nice if we were more virtuous, but how can we get there from where we actually are? And then a question for Cengiz. It was very moving to hear you talk, because I also had a chapter on the Kurds in Turkey, and it's just very impressive to hear from somebody who knows much more about it empirically. I just had the question concerning your last slide and concerning Syria. Isn't it the case that there it was the model that was realized there is much closer to the HTP model than to the PKK model, simply because it is more territorial organized? I didn't really understand the PKK model, how it could possibly work to have all kinds of rights for all nations, but not be territorial. And I think, as I understood your presentation of Northern Syria, it was in the end territorial, but very bottom up and much on the municipal and regional level. Thank you.
I wanted to ask the same question as Andreas, the last one, about this cultural autonomy, but then in fact it seemed a more territorial autonomy. But since this question was made, I would like to ask Peter, why do you distinguish or make two distinguishing factors of homogeneity and diversity? Cannot they be included in the same one? I mean, something like this, if diversity is praised, then it's not homogeneous, or is diversity just a kind of value and homogeneity more a kind of descriptive issue? If it's only a descriptive issue, I think it's not important. I think it's more what you want and what you do.
Any other question?
Hi, thank you. It's for Victoria. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on the relationship between civic virtue and political coercion, or some forms of political coercion as a precondition for civic virtue, because you said that, and in your in some of your texts criticizing Rawls, you said, correct me if I'm wrong, something like, it is great to expect a lot from people, basically, but you need some certain institutional preconditions, and those preconditions might have to do sometimes with the law and some forms of political coercion, the use of state power in order to create, to set a system where virtues can be fostered and so on. So if you could elaborate on that, thank you.
Okay, thanks. So it's really complicated. What I was thinking is that in Pettit's presentation, he puts a lot of trust on the law as a source of non-domination, which to a certain extent is true if you have some rights that are actually protected by law. then you enjoy more freedom in important areas of your life. That's true. But then he also says in chapter 8 in Republicanism that you need these social norms to kind of supplement the working of the law. If people don't internalize some norms that are kind of consistent with the law, then the laws are not really going to be properly implemented. And my response to that is that social norms is not the same as civic virtue. He tends to identify them when he describes them, because it seems that the motivation, the norms, what makes us comply with the norms in the explanation that Pettit and Brennan gives is primarily that we want the approval of others, and that's a big source of good behavior. And I would like to say, well, but we also need something else, like a check on that. That is some kind of capacity to reflect on the norms and maybe to be open to change them. And so it seems that there are different things, the internalizing norms and being reflective about them and have the right attitude towards the norms, but also the norms and the laws too. And then you need the norms and the laws, because not everybody is going to be very virtuous. So, but there are different things in my view. But then the big question is, how do we get these civic virtues? And the traditional answer is the state could have a politics of virtue and try to encourage desirable traits, but the state can be blind. And it just seems that part of the work has to be done by groups of citizens themselves when the state doesn't really take into account their points of view, their needs, their interests, and their claims. So some of it will be self-organizing and groups educating themselves, reflecting, finding strategies, and a little bit changing the way that we think that social norms should operate. But that's very tricky, because social norms, we can't control it as much as we could control a law. If we manage to get the majority in parliament, we could pass new laws and then that's it, we got the laws. But how do we change social norms? That just seems like a hard work that takes a long time, and it's not going to be fully successful. But I think there is some contestation on social norms and some challenges of social norms until what's the normal expected thing becomes something else. And then we may become used to doing things in different ways. But it's, I guess I don't have an answer. How do we change social norms? Part of it is this critical challenges, and people daring to live in different ways. But sometimes that involves paying some cost in terms of getting some backlash, right? And then what happens with political coercion is that the law is enforced coercively. And so then the question is, again, are these laws justified? Do they support freedom as non-domination, or are they dominating laws? And that's not that clear. So we have to figure out exactly what are the more serious forms of domination and what are the ways that the law could address them. But you do need political coercion to enforce basic rights of people. You have to have political coercion to protect people against being killed, beaten up, and harmed in other ways. But assumedly, I assume that if you are a good citizen, you will also support the enforcement of certain laws. And but then the question is, how do we get good laws? And that, again, I don't have the answer to that question. What I was trying to do in the paper is look at this not from the point of view of like a well-ordered republic where everything fits nicely, but think from the kind of real world. What do I want a theory of freedom as non-domination to do? And it should help us identify the more serious forms of domination, and then help us think about ways of changing them. Okay, thanks.
Should I go? Yeah, thank you for your question. the similarities between Syria and the HDP's project, yes, I think the territorial element, basically this decentralization. HDP is a party of Turkey, so 20 to 25 local decentralized entities is across Turkey, not just Kurds. But by default, so the areas where there is a Kurdish majority, they will have all the Kurdish rights. And the PKK's model is more about organizing Kurds as a nation. And it's about sort of limiting state power over the community or over the society. And it wants to empower the society. So it has councils like civil society organizations. It has some such representative bodies through which the society is organized and through which the people take part in politics. Now, the idea, so as I mentioned, Öcalan is in prison. So he's the one who comes up with these ideas. And because he's a prisoner, he's not allowed to send his books or his written text and publish them. So what he did was there was a process of European Court of Human Rights application, which looked at his case again. And he was writing sort of a response to the court or something like that, like a statement to the court. And that became the model, basically. He wasn't writing like a legal response, but he was creating a political discourse. And he published that. And then the PKK took those ideas and tried to express it in the way it understood. And there's a lot of ambiguity, also because essentially the final model will come into being through a process of negotiations with the state. So there's a kind of they leave certain bits out. But so within Turkey, it wants to organize a Kurdish community, Kurdish nation, but also it wants an entity which it calls the Kurdistan Kurdistan Communities Union, the KCK, which will operate across the 4 nation states. And this will have some sort of, it will have like a council where Kurdish autonomous regions send representatives, and perhaps where things like language planning and cultural planning and things like that will be decided. So that's that kind of a model. It basically, the idea of territory autonomy can be, it's easier to organize an autonomy through a territorial model because it works with that representative democracy. So you have a part of a territory of a state which has its own institutions, and it has certain amount of rights and power. And with the non-territorial element, it's more difficult because states don't want that. Or they don't have mechanisms to incorporate those kind of demands. So it's essentially a direct democracy it wants. And so essentially, whether direct democracy is possible or not, that question also applies to this model as well, I think. But so the Syria part, initially it was they were talking about democratic autonomy. Now it's about federalism. It's a decentralized form of federalism. So within itself, it's decentralized, and Kurdish rights or rights of minorities are respected across that region, not only places where there are a significant amount of people of that minority. So it kind of combines both territorial and non-territorial forms. Thank you.
You want to answer?
Yes, very briefly. I think the question is fully justified. And actually, I had thought about this myself already. I think it's just looking at the same thing as you already remarked, but from different perspectives, whereas the homogeneity dimension would rather point at the historical, at the genealogical way the collectivity has been formed, basically. So the origins it's making, etc. The diversity perspective would look at how it is now, right? How things have changed, for example, due to immigration from other areas in the Catalan case, etc. So it's more, let's say, the historical and the contemporary perspective on the same phenomenon. And then this comes together actually in the way sovereignty is being thought of in this kind of new transnational context, vis-a-vis historical legacies and injustices. But I agree with you. It's basically, logically, it's the same thing. I was brief.
Very brief. Okay, so that's it. I hope you have enjoyed it a lot, and I think we have learned a lot during this day, even if we are a bit tired now. So thank you very much to all the speakers for their effort, and for those of you for your contributions and for your interest. And thank you very much to the Fundació Josep Irla per l'esforç d'organització i ja està. Gràcies a tots.